Read the works. Perfect. No worries, Robin. Looking at the works of Dr. Kelly Cross, Dr. Leroy Long III, Dr. James Holly Jr., Dr. Brooke Coley, and Denise Simmons are just a set of guest editorials that have come out in the Journal of Engineering Education that can allow you to quickly understand how racism is manifesting in engineering education, particularly for these scholars coming from a Black perspective. But there are also other articles out there and many other authors out there. blackinengineering.org is a great place to start when it comes to thinking about how we create mechanisms of activism and support within our own environments and our own practices. When it comes to talking about LGBTQ experiences, Aaron Seck's work recently has come out highlighting that LGBTQ individuals experience higher levels of harassment than non-LGBTQ identifying individuals. This aligns with many of the experiences that I saw as an engineering and emerging engineering educator. And so OSTEM, Novel Step are two places to go to for some of those support resources. And then the other conversation that you're seeing show up is an emerging mental health crisis, particularly within graduate education and STEM environments. And these numbers were before the pandemic, of upwards of 50% of STEM graduate students are indicating levels that are potentially diagnosable of depression and anxiety. And these mental health crises are more impactful for women and people of color. And there's a recent study coming out showing that there are some ties from the lived experiences on the left-hand side of the slide of racism and discrimination to mental health as well. And so when we talk about these conversations, there are many problems that exist within engineering education. I encourage you to read some of these articles that I've cited here, in addition to other resources. But what I've tried to do in my work is start to look at how these problems influence students' beliefs in subject and subsequent choices. And there's limited work that's really taken this conversation into context of how students' experiences influence their beliefs and their choices, and why I use motivation and identity as a framework. So some people will look at me and say, oh, why are you not using problem solving? Why are you not using just grade performance? And a lot of this comes down to people's levels of motivation and actions are based on what they believe rather than what's objectively the case. So we can design an environment that does this, does that. But at the same time, how students believe and how students are motivated in an environment really shapes the conversations that they're going to have, the actions that they're going to take. And so one of the things that, if nothing else in this conversation, I want y'all to walk away with: identity and motivation are things. They are things that can be measured. They are things that have purposeful definitions, and they are things that have specific constructs underneath them. And so motivation is one of those words that exists in the research, but also exists in our daily lives. And so when we talk about motivation and identity, we don't just measure, oh, I feel motivated today, or I don't feel motivated today. There are specific ways we can measure these. And so the first way when I start talking about identity is measuring role identity or engineering identity. So how people see themselves as an engineer. And so seeing oneself as an engineer is composed of a couple of constructs of performance competence. So do you feel like you can perform in an environment? Recognition, so do people see you as an engineer? And interest, I'm interested in engineering. And these three things combine to help shape how people see themselves as an engineer. And this is a present-oriented measure. So identity is often looking at, do you see yourself as an engineer right now? Do you see yourself as an emerging engineer right now? And so when we talk about motivation, the one that y'all will hear me talk about over and over again, and you will hear my students use in almost every conversation that we have, is future time perspective. So future time perspective is one of the million of handfuls of motivation theories that exist out there. Robin, I'm sure the question that I asked you at ASEE was about some other motivation framework potentially. But future time perspective looks at how students' goals for the future influence their present tasks. And there's a range of constructs that fall under future time perspective. But some of the key ones are clarity of future. So how clearly someone sees their future goals. Do you have a single goal or multiple goals. And then the concept of perceived instrumentality. So do I see what I'm doing now as useful for helping me get to my future? And so using the picture on the slide to help kind of articulate FTP a little bit more. So you see the individual in the front in the orange and purple striped shirt, which might be my Clemson lineage coming out, who knows? But the orange, and so thinking you're seeing 4 different conceptions of self show up in the future of chef, astronaut, engineer, science communicator. And when we look at these 4 conversations, you see 3 that are maybe really clear for students. So you see chef, engineer, engineering communicator as 3 that are very clear, where the astronaut is less clear. You're seeing less of the thing, so maybe it seems less realistic, less attainable for the student. And then if we were to step this into then their daily life of how does this engineering problem that I'm giving you in your intro engineering course or in your unit ops course relate to that? How are they judging the relationship of that conversation? And so what we found is that students who are very focused on only one of these only see a very narrow set of things as relevant to what they're doing, where students who have many perceptions of the future have that conversation. And so, again, we've done a real quick dive into motivation theory and identity theory. And I wanted to save some time just so we had conversation, be able to have some conversations about some of the findings in these theories. So if you'll have more questions about these, I'm happy to answer these as we go through. But again, the big thing is motivation's a thing, identity is a thing, and we can measure them. And so why do you want to go through the effort of figuring out what the thing is and measuring it? Motivation and identity have been connected to each other, and they've been connected to crucial engineering outcomes. So my own work has looked at engineering, students' perceptions of the future and problem solving. And what we've seen is that students with strong definitions of the future are more likely to persist on problem solving tasks if they're relevant to their future. Where students who see more things as their future possibilities will see more tasks as relevant, but then they don't have as much time to focus and persist on one. And so this basically what we're seeing is students' perceptions of the future dictate how they evaluate and then perform on present tasks. And we've also seen that students are more likely to memorize, regurgitate, and forget things when they're not relevant to their future. And so when we look at this conversation in other work, we see that motivation and identity and aspects of identity are tied to learning. So in Jones's work, you see that they predicted self-efficacy, which is a parallel to that performance competence thing I talked about earlier, and expectancy, which is a parallel to some of the future time perspective conversations, predicts students' grade point averages. So you see that predicting students' grade point average. And then in recent work that I did with Dr. Allison Godwin from Purdue University, we found that identity predicts motivation, which then predicts students' intentions to persist or perceived intentions to persist and interest in a major. And so all of these are crucial engineering education outcomes. If we don't develop problem solvers, we have some problems in engineering. If they're not learning, we have some problems. If they're not persisting, we have problems. And so when we look at these frameworks, work is emerging across all of these conversations of there are differential experiences when it comes to identity formation opportunities, motivation fostering opportunities for traditionally underserved groups and populations. And we're seeing this show up again and again across the literature. And so part of what I've done is we've seen these connections to outcomes, but my work is shifting from examining motivation and identity as precursors to these outcomes to using them as signals of systemic problems. So trying to look at them as these signals. And part of why we're doing this, it's already been connected to crucial educational outcomes. Folks are and have done work showing these connections again and again. It's responsive to context, experience, and intervention. So motivation and identity, we can poke and it will change. We can poke negatively or we can poke positively, but we can adjust our practices to create changes around these frameworks. And then the last piece is it's accessible through discussion and measurement. When you talk about motivation and identity in an interview, it's hard to get students to shut up. It's hard to get students to not talk about these things, but then they'll also talk about other things that they may not talk about. And particularly as a white, cis, straight presenting male in an interview room, particularly if I'm interviewing students of color, women, that I can have an influence where they don't necessarily want to talk about bias or discrimination or other experiences that they've had. But this has often been a gateway in our work to talking about other things, of using motivation and identity has served to see kind of these comorbidities that have shown up of your motivation and identity is low. Oh, and you've had this negative experience. And so what we're going to do through the last little bit of this presentation, and I realize last little bit is halfway through where I'm saying that. And so in this last half of the presentation, I'm going to present 3.5 vignettes from my work, where motivation and identity are showing up alongside some of these systemic problems. And so the first one that we're going to talk about is motivation and identity as a signal of bias and discrimination. And so this is part of a larger grant looking at perceived bias in engineering identity development in graduate student communities, and particularly looking at doctoral student experiences. And so in this project, we sought to highlight how experiences of bias and discrimination influence motivations and identities. And so methods are a place to save some time where I didn't go super in depth in this presentation. So if we have questions on this on the back end, I'm happy to talk about those as well. But we did 30 interviews with graduate students about discrimination and bias with a selected sample trying to target women, people of color, and people at those intersecting identities to understand the ways that systems overlap and oppress and create and allow experiences of bias to flourish. We borrowed from descriptive phenomenology. And so in the results that I present here, we did a subsample of a national survey, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. Again, targeting the same population to understand their experiences of bias and discrimination with a novel survey that we created from literature, but also very heavily leaning on students' experiences. And so some of the quantitative results were ANOVAs with post hoc pairwise comparisons that we utilized. But when we talk about discrimination and bias showing up in people's experiences, we see that experiences of discrimination in everyday interactions limits engineering identities. So when we look at the quote on the screen, I was in a PhD program and I left with a master's degree because I was experiencing so much hostility in terms of sexism and racism. And it was causing me severe health issues that I actually ended up being hospitalized. This is not the only version of this conversation that showed up consistently across our data. And so what we saw in terms of further conversations is being perceived as a woman in an engineering environment served to reduce recognition opportunities. So Anya didn't see herself as being able to fit in. She didn't see herself as being able to be an engineer because of the signals that she was getting from her environment. And so to get to this quote in the interview, we started with identity and started this conversation of, do you see yourself as an engineer? And it was, no, not really. And then moved into this conversation of, now these are your experiences and these are how you've experienced an engineering environment. And so when we looked at our subsample of our national survey, we saw that unfair treatment is actually higher for women and predicts lower recognition of engineering identities. So people being seen by others as engineers. For all of us, when we go through these conversations, we want people to see us as an engineer. We want people to see us as the thing we're trying to get to. But being a woman was predictive. There were other factors that were also predictive in this conversation, including sexuality, in terms of lower recognition of engineering identities. And so here in this particular set of results that I'm presenting, we used unfair treatment as a proxy for discrimination and bias because discrimination and bias both have legal definitions that many students are not comfortable talking about. And so we used unfair treatment to access some of these other conversations because in our interviews, students were asked to cook meals for their lab mates, hem people's pants, and then also do work for lab mates so the lab mate could go to a concert on the weekend and the student had a funeral that they were debating attending or not. And so when we talk about these experiences, what we saw across the data is that it's about 16% of our students see at least one source of unfair treatment, either from their advisor, a secondary advisor, or another faculty member. And while some of you may look at these numbers and go, oh, that's not that many people, the problem that happens in graduate education is if one person drops out, your lab is more likely, statistically more likely to see serial dropouts across your laboratory environment. And so thinking about it as somebody who's, at times fighting to get tenure for people who are trying to get promotion, if you're losing multiple students because of unfair treatment, that has serious deleterious effects on your lab and on your environment. And so we can see this, but again, identity is easy to measure. These unfair treatment experiences were harder to get at, and also hard for these students to share and to relive. And so again, when we look at lowered identities, if we're seeing consistent patterns of lowered identities for certain populations, we can lean into that and say, there's something probably happening here, and looking at the ways that our environment's manifesting. And so continuing on this trend of examining graduate student experiences, is motivation and identity can serve as a signal of how education fosters a mental health crisis. And so this comes out of the project where that national survey came from, as we explored how engineering graduate students' motivations and identities connect to their experiences. And this work is very heavily motivated by my first graduate school experience. I had a very negative experience. I wasn't motivated. I didn't see myself as belonging in that space due to a number of external factors and some internal factors. And so my colleague and I, who had a shared experience, sought to understand the motivations and identities of particularly doctoral students. And so we surveyed over 200 engineering departments across the country. Thank you to those departments and the participants in our studies. And we ended up with about 2,400 survey responses. And we used a technique called latent profile analysis to create motivation and identity profiles. And basically the idea behind latent profile analysis is it's the art of unscrambling eggs. So your egg has the yolk, it has the whites, it has the albumin, it's got these different pieces, but when you scramble them, they're all together. Latent profile analysis pulls out those similarities within your data. And then we interviewed 35 students who represented each of these profiles in our work about their motivations and identities exclusively. And so from that perspective, we didn't ask them questions about discrimination and bias. We didn't ask them questions about mental health. But when we talked to students about their motivations and identities, what we found pretty consistently across our low motivation groups is that students with low motivations highlighted mental and physical symptoms at potentially diagnosable levels. And so Jacob, for example, I do remember being kind of depressed, for chunks of it. So that's what I think of when I think back to my PhD. I'm like, oh, remember that time when you were depressed and didn't want to live anymore? Suicidal ideation is showing up alongside these low motivations of our students. And so again, we didn't ask this student anything about their mental health in this interview. Not a thing. This came up as we were talking about motivations and how they couldn't construct goals for the future because they could barely construct goals for tomorrow. And so we're seeing these show up with motivations and students with inabilities to construct perceptions of the future, but we also saw this show up where students in low identity groups wanted to be able to talk about this. So I used the term healing-centered environments early on in this presentation. One of the key features of a healing-centered environment is empowering students to be able to talk about things. And identities are a way to empower students. If they can see themselves as part of this space, they may feel empowered to change the space. And as Ash talked about, after a long conversation of their mental health, again, we only asked Ash about their identities in the interviews, is a lot of students would like to speak up about their mental health. But there's such a retaliatory culture in academia that students don't want to. Again, we're starting to see, we went in looking at, all right, just why do you have low identities, low motivations? And these students are starting to say, there's a problem here. There's a conversation that's really a problem here. And so this last one is a pivot. So this last example that I'm going to give before I give the half example is a pivot of motivation and identity as mechanisms of exclusion. So we explored undergraduate students' experiences to understand how normative motivations and identities are privileged in engineering. So this idea of, I see myself as an engineer, I'm going to really persist through all of the hard things. It was hard for me, therefore it was hard for you, and it's better for everyone involved, is something that we wanted to look at. Does having those attitudes lead to sets of privileging? And so what we did is we surveyed about 3,000 students across 4 institutions. And we use topological data analysis, which is very similar to that latent profile analysis thing of creating groups. It creates groups and structure to your data. And it allowed us to characterize students across 13 dimensions related to motivations and identities and a couple of other attitudinal constructs. We then interviewed students, 23 students from the different profiles, once per semester for 3 years. So one of the things that you will see in engineering education data is people screaming for longitudinal studies. This was one of the longitudinal studies that we were able to conduct. And what we saw is that just in this preliminary surveying that happened on the front end of the data is a large, what we call the normative group, alongside smaller non-normative attitudinal groups. And so one of the things that's really interesting here is we didn't apply demographics as a sorting mechanism in this data. And so what you see, we'll start from the top and work our way down. So starting with the green arrow and working our way down is that large normative group across the top that's got all those densely populated and big bubbles. The bigger the bubble, the more people, the closer together those bubbles are, the more similar that they are. And so we saw this large normative group with similar motivations and identities. And then we saw these smaller groups that had very similar and shared identities, shared motivations and identities, but they were distinct from that larger normative group. And then the last thing that we saw is this disparate group of students who didn't connect to these larger populations within the engineering environment. One of the things that came out of the quantitative is this normative group is overwhelmingly white and male. And so it's beyond representation in terms of, so it's not just, oh, it's proportional to the number of white men in the sample, it's actually overrepresented by white men. And so if this is the default attitudinal profile in our group, okay, but if these other ones exist, these give us places where we can help students connect to others who think like them, who have motivations like them, who have identities like them. Problem that came up is when we interviewed these students over time, their attitudes, their motivations, their identities shifted to that normative group. And so those normative group attitudes were also then applied to exclude other students from engineering or evaluate their value in an engineering environment. And so the phrase that got echoed again and again and again across 49 interviews with students is anyone can do engineering, but not everyone. So students always said consistently, anyone can do this, but not everyone. And what you see is, I think anybody can do engineering if they really want to. Some people just don't really enjoy things that go into doing it, like math. There's a lot of math that goes into engineering, and I think that turns people off. And so when we talk about the engineering population, one of the concerns here is if a student comes from a background where maybe they haven't had the opportunities to engage and learn and develop their mathematics identity or their mathematics interests, they may be excluded because someone's saying, oh, you don't like math, or you're struggling in math. So if this thing gets signaled as difficult rather than interesting. So if a student's like, this math is hard, and they see this as difficult, these students who are in this large normative group that's only growing and recruiting with time may see this as a mechanism of, I don't belong here. I don't belong because this is too difficult for me, I gotta go. And so consistently, we saw students use knowledge, skills, and abilities. So those KSAs that came out of the TWOS report from many years ago show up again and again. And the thing that we were most surprised with in this conversation is that this was a student-to-student level exclusion. This wasn't a faculty or system to student exclusion, but rather students within the engineering environment were creating evaluations of each other and recreating this exclusive system. And so kind of what I've hit on very quickly and covering 15 years of project work is motivation and identity can serve as signals of problems in engineering education. But the other thing is they can serve as signals of emerging problems within engineering education. So I remember I said I was going to present 3.5 vignettes. This is the half vignette. All of the data I just talked about came before COVID, came before the reemergence and refocusing on racial injustices that were already there, that were already existing, but this reemergence, refocusing, the hyper visibility that's been coming from that conversation is starting to show up in our data and show up in a couple of different ways. First, we're seeing year-over-year declines in motivations for the future. So we looked at students, we sampled their FTPs in a large scale, in a department level sample as part of another project. And what we saw is the students who were sampled this year compared to 2 years ago show significantly lower future time perspectives than those who are currently, so they're struggling to envision a future. They're struggling to envision mechanisms for their success. And this is from a high achieving institution where students traditionally have job opportunities in their junior year, sometimes even in their sophomore year. The other thing that we're seeing is this lack of real experiences. So consistently across our data, we're seeing students saying, this doesn't feel real. This can't, I'm at YouTube University. This doesn't feel like a thing, and it's undercutting identity development. So our students are unable to be recognized by their faculty members. They're unable to be recognized by their peers. And then the last piece that we're seeing is experiences of bias and discrimination are on the rise, and this is showing up in our bias and discrimination data. So we've since gone on from that study that I showed you and have done a national survey with our bias and discrimination items. And we're seeing students talk about more recent experiences, realistic experiences that are continuing to show up. And so kind of hopefully what I've highlighted or at least primed throughout this conversation is motivation and identity are signals, but also they're intervention targets for discrimination and bias, mental illness and exclusion. So creating interventions that can maybe either eliminate or reduce the effects of. And so remember when I said, I'm going to introduce a problem and then I'm going to give you some actions. And so the first act to walk away with is, y'all can measure motivation and identity in your classes. There are surveys that are 5 minutes long where you can measure motivation and identity in your classroom environments, your departmental environments, your lab environments. But then you can also intervene. You can use that data to intervene in a conversation. And so what we're seeing on the identity front is that creating interactive environments where students can be seen as engineers is really important, even if they're informal environments. So if they're informal gathering environments where students can see themselves and other people, can see others as engineers, can help eliminate that non-reality feeling or that unreal feeling of what's happening. But creating environments where people can talk to each other. You know, that engineering thing that we supposedly don't do well, making sure that folks have interactive environments where they can talk to each other. Giving people projects to carry around campus is also emerging from our data of that. For us, it looks like a pizza box, but it's a hovercraft that they carry around campus and people are like, oh, you've got the pink pizza box. And then they're like, you're an engineer. And so these opportunities, we have to be creative in our defaults when we talk about our online education reality that we're in. We all shifted our knowledge to put, content online, but how are we putting these experiences that foster these, what are considered difficult to measure, which they're not, things of motivation and identity in our online environments? For those of you with graduate students or with undergrads, quite frankly, utilize individualized development plans to help students craft and communicate goals for their futures that you can then hold them accountable to. Those accountability structures matter for students to help practice their goals for the futures and continue to do these things. There's a program out of the AAAS called My IDP. It's already built for you. Your students go in and take a survey. They talk about the skills that they have. They talk about the careers that they want to end up in. And then you use that to set goals for this semester, for the year, and you evaluate progress towards those goals. The last one, I've said this a couple of different times, and I'm going to keep saying this because this is really where my work is going in the future, is foster healing-centered environments that build identity and motivation. Empower your students to take control of parts of their environment. Empower them to understand the ways that they can work. Empower them to dream about the future. Many of our students right now aren't even thinking about the future because who knows if we're going to be in person next week, online next week, whatever it may be. But creating environments where students can share their experiences, start to reset physiological defaults, not just mental defaults, but the physical manifestations of these negative environments can start to reset and allow them to build motivations and identities. And so I'm going to end here with these conversations of a few implications for practice. There's 1,000 million more I could talk about. But really the goal of this conversation is to prompt y'all to think about how you can bring engineering identity and motivation into your work, either as part of your research or as part of your evidence body that you use to provide feedback on the things that you're doing. So I'll stop here for questions, conversations, and dialogue, and then we can talk about other things. I'm also going to stop sharing my screen so we can see faces and other stuff.
You have a number of questions in the Q&A. I think people are asking about what low identity group means and also whether it's persistent or whether that changes.
So your profile, so the profiles that we built related to low identity groups were relative. So all of these conversations were relative. Many of these students were above the average for our survey. So our average was on a scale from, I think it was 1 to 5. So they were above that 3 marker. But there was a group across that performance competence metric, the recognition metric, and the interest metric that were significantly lower than the other groups. And so when we talk about low identity groups, it's on those particular measures that they showed a consistent pattern of low responses, relatively low responses. That being said, those groups are not necessarily static over time. So what we found going from creating the groups to doing the interviews is some of our students had shifted. Some of our students had shifted positively up, and then from some of those higher motivation groups, some of those students shifted down into those lower motivation groups based on their interview responses in the data.
Can I ask a follow-up to that person's question?
Yes.
Are the items in that identification with survey, are they like engineering discipline dependent, or how are those designed?
So we designed the engineering identity items for graduate students. So we took the undergraduate engineering identity measures and took them into a series of 41 interviews with engineering PhD students to understand the ways that they were seeing their identities. And we saw 3 domains of identity emerge. We saw an engineering identity, a scientist identity, and a researcher identity show up. And so when we looked at the quantitative data, that researcher and scientist identity tended to merge. And what's interesting is in our data, our students tended to not see themselves as using their engineering identity. They saw themselves, the graduate students saw themselves just as using their researcher scientist identity, and that their environments weren't fostering use of an existing high identity. All right, so one of the other questions that I'm seeing is pointing out some of the 5-minute motivation and identity surveys. So in particular, the identity survey has a single item measure that you can use. It is, I see myself as an engineer. And so there is a whole research conversation of why you don't use just one item in your measures for a broader, bigger research conversation. But for a class perspective, I see myself as an engineer, strongly disagree to strongly agree. It's 30 seconds. I think about some of the self-efficacy scales from, there's some of Carberry's work where they've used some design self-efficacy scales. You can break out the subcomponents of that and get through those in probably 6 minutes at most. If you did one of those blocks, you can probably get through it in 2 to 3. There's also some broader stuff from Bandura's work, from DC and Ryan's work on self-determination theory. The future time perspective ones, you could give a piece of the future time perspective surveys that we've used in our work in the past. You can see that in that Godwin and Kirn 2020 paper. You could pick a factor and just give out one factor. And if you're going to use the future time perspective ones, the perceptions of future is a really high predictive block of many different things. And so that would be one I would encourage. So. All right. So I'm going to go after Fred's question because I think it's interesting and exciting. And this is a question I've been asked a couple of times, but I think it's the overlap and differences with stereotype threat and imposter syndrome. I think you see a whole lot of overlap when you talk about identity and you talk about, imposter syndrome. I don't see myself as fitting in this space. Could be just an imposter thing where you're unqualified. You feel unqualified. For example, being nervous about giving an invited talk in an online seminar might be one of those cases. And so that's one of the conversations of, I think there's a lot of overlap between the two conversations. I think stereotype threat is a piece that feeds into this. So when we talk about experiences feeding in to motivation and identity, I think you see stereotype threat directly feeding into that conversation of these ideas of being undercut. And if you look at Claude Steele's work, that's basically what Claude Steele measured, was stereotype threat undercutting self-efficacy and competence and performance on surveys. Robin, I was trying to keep track of questions, but between the chats and the Q&As, I've lost track of where I was. Is there another one that was on
You're
your
fine.
list?
Yeah, I'd like to ask, I'm not going to try to say the name of the person who asked it, and I apologize. But with respect to COVID-19 pandemic, what sort of identities do you think are enabling students to stay motivated on their engineering programs or causing them to leave engineering?
I think, when we talk about identities, so this is actually my former grad student who's a postdoc here at UNR, Marissa Sugawa. Her doctoral work looked at it came up talking about competing identities with graduate students. And so graduate students talked about their social identities, like being a parent or having responsibilities outside of work, as competing and undermining their ability to develop their researcher and engineering identities. And so when we talk about COVID-19, it has only stressed those identities. I think, Robin, we were talking about this before we started, of you are working with a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old at home. And that identity of being a parent becomes so much more salient for so many of our students. And that intersects with other pieces of identity and cultural defaults of a woman often has higher caretaking responsibilities for kids, and therefore you're seeing a double whammy show up in some of those conversations. And so those are some of the things that are undercutting, things that are helping students, is being able to identify with a group. So being able to, we have a cohort program going through right now that I didn't really talk about in this presentation, where students in this cohort are like, yeah, we show up and we designed fake kitchen tools for a prompt, but we got to hang out with each other. We got to talk to each other. And I think part of this is our default for many has been to go asynchronous. And I think having those opportunities to practice with others is really important, because at times our students are not able to, not necessarily willing to, not, any number of reasons that could be undercutting their desires to, interact with others, where if we create some of these environments, they're having benefits. So.
I also have a question about whether any of your work has looked at international students and whether they're interesting in maybe different findings with those students.
We have looked at international students in the graduate program a little bit. We've got some work coming out of that. One of the things that we're seeing is that our international students tend to have higher motivations for the future in particular. And I think part of this is, part of what we are speculating in this conversation is they have made such a bigger choice of, they're often very far from home, they're very far from resources, and you're seeing, I'm going to finish this degree. It doesn't matter, because part of it is, if I don't finish this degree, then what? Because then the options for staying, the options for other employment become increasingly complicated. And so we've seen higher perceptions of the future in that, and I forget, there was one other construct as well that showed up.
Alex Mejia always asks interesting and difficult questions. So is this a matter of not measuring identity, or is it an issue of not creating a system where students can actually develop an identity in a healthy way, where their lived realities are acknowledged and valued? Are we dictating how students should develop their identity if we're measuring certain aspects of their lives and not really taking accountability for what we all need to do in engineering to really create change? If we measure identity and decide what students need to work on, aren't we perpetuating a negative and normative engineering discourse?
Yes, in some ways. So Alex, thank you for this set of questions. And so part of why I am, pitching to measure these, and I'm not saying that the measures that I presented are perfect. When we talk about engineering identity, it's not the only identity that students bring with them to the table. And so part of this is, if we can design to foster identity and motivation at some level, we're going to pull along some other pieces of identity and motivation. And if we start measuring these things, we're going to start thinking about motivation and identity. And so if you talk to a lot of psychologists, they will talk about, particular educational psychologists, will tell you that engineering is one of the most amotivationally or demotivationally designed environments in our education system. And so if we think about ways to shift those designs of students feel comfortable with the title of engineer, they may be comfortable with the title of gay engineer. They may be more comfortable with some. And so as we start measuring some of these things, there are multiple pieces. And so my work does not sit alone or by itself in this conversation. There are many other people looking at the intersections of social identities alongside these engineering or role identities. And quite frankly, yes, I think there's potentially a conversation to say, what are the different ways we can see ourselves as an engineer? And so Maura Borrego's work has looked at extending some of these items as well, in particular to look at other ways that engineering may come into the fold or come into play. And some people have asked the question of, as we look across disciplines, this generic measure of engineering identity may not work as well when we talk about disciplines that are more interdisciplinary or novel or emerging.
Actually, that jumps back to Mark Gusdale asked about with some of those and CS students in particular, many of whom, like at some institutions, that's called engineering and at others it's not.
And yeah, so when we look at CS students, like CS is a really interesting example because in some places it's business, some places it's science, some places it's health sciences, in some places it's engineering. And a lot of, our computer scientists in some of our data are like, I'm not an engineer, I'm a scientist. Like that's, the approach and perspective that they took. And so I think those are really interesting questions when it comes to, looking at that and looking at the ways that the engineering identity world has opened up and people have latched on. But I think there's much room to play.
Patty O'Brien Novak asks about co-op work and job experiences and how those might impact, or whether any of your work has looked at how those might impact the process of developing an engineering identity.
We have not, in my work, we've not specifically looked at that. In particular, I can speak to, some anecdotes of it can be really great for students. So there's one student in my data who talked about having a co-op experience that was wonderful and they loved it and it helped them create goals for the future. We've had other students talk about, I hated this, and it undercut their goals for the future or sent them into spaces of re-examining their futures, of looking at all of these things are relevant. And so I think that's a big part of that question of it can influence these things. And I think this would be a great extension of my work to look at those co-op and industry experiences.
And Sarah Bork asks about larger scale interventions to address mental health concerns for graduate students in engineering besides advisor-mentee relationship.
Not much is the short answer to that question. So when you look at the graduate mental health literature, it's thin. It's real thin. I think one of my students did a lit review and found maybe 10 papers recently. And I think there's some folks as well. I think Sarah is maybe one of them who's also done some work in that conversation. And so I think really where I've started looking is at some of the community engagement literature, and looking at urban education literature has done a lot around the trauma experiences of Black youth. And so there are some work around creating healing-centered engagement groups where students get together and talk about the things that they want to do, talk about the political actions that they want to take. And this is where there's an article floating around that I cannot find to save my life right now that talks about service as a mechanism of healing and a mechanism of allowing someone to be themselves in an environment. And we so often discourage our students from doing anything other than their research, that these things that are outside of their research but connect to who they are can shift that conversation.
And Jennifer Rosemary Pollard is asking about NSBE and SHIP as I think as forms of identity building, engineering identity building.
Yes. So in general, you see those show up as identity building experiences. You talk to members of those organizations, you will see them identify very quickly with those. The key tenets of NSBE, anybody who's been in NSBE for more than 10 minutes usually can rip off the, I think it's the 6 tenets of NSBE in their principles. The number is wrong. I have not committed them to memory. But that's for sure a conversation when we look at those, identity affiliated groups. And we had some of those groups participate in some of our surveys as well, and looking at some of those conversations as support mechanisms.
Okay, I know that I skipped over a couple, and I think that people might want to ask some of these on their own. So I'm going to stop the recording. And